We are here with Greg Chipp, CEO of Drug Policy Australia. How are you going today, Greg?
Hello, Jeff. Pretty good.
It's great. How long have you been with this organisation, and what was your motivation for getting started?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. The organisation did take a fair bit of effort to get off the ground. We looked around about 3.5 years ago. This is me and a couple of people that were fairly dissatisfied. Anybody that came out with an alternative approach to reforming drug policy was labelled as being soft on drugs. So we looked at various structures for an organisation, and we decided that we needed a powerful advocacy group in Australia that can put to the Australian public the rational argument that these drug laws, this drug prohibition, is actually hurting our kids. It's not doing what it's proposed or was purported to do 40 or 50 years ago, of protect our children from drug use. The fact, as we see it, is that the prohibition, prohibiting, criminalising drug users, in actual puts our kids in harm's way.
It's detrimental to people's lives and well-being.
Absolutely.
We need a radical overhaul of the current system.
Well, that was what we decided, and I'm talking eminent Australians, Dr. John Sherman, who is a director of the organisation. He's an addiction specialist and author on the topic of drugs. He's treated addicts, heroin addicts, for over 40 years and is a specialist in his field. And at any rate, we came together with the need that we needed to get a professional organisation to brand and communicate the alternative approach, to counter the propaganda, the misinformation that's been put out by, I guess, people with a vested interest, with a Puritan ethic, people that...
serving their own agenda, aren't they?
Well, at this stage, I think it's fair to say, Jeff, they are serving their own agenda now. The whole prohibition is now feeding on itself. You've got the prison being fed by people being locked up for drug crimes. You've got the whole court system employing thousands of people. You've got the police system.
That's right.
A lot of figures that have coming out. In fact, this figure comes from a federal parliamentary inquiry into the cost of cannabis prohibition. Said that it was $500 million, and that was made up by $250 million, $250 million on enforcement costs, and the $500 million figure would also, if we were to legalise cannabis, be augmented by taxation.
Yep.
And I think would be spent on rehabilitation.
That's right, and public schools and hospitals and places where it's going to have a positive impact on the community.
There's an opportunity cost to the drug prohibition, and that's what a lot of people don't get. It's as if we've got unlimited resources in Australia and the world to attempt to stop people using drugs. And look, I suppose if that was plausible, if that was possible, there might be a case to say, well, the prohibition makes some sense. But the bottom line is, one, it's not plausible or practical.
None whatsoever.
But this opportunity cost you talk about, worldwide, enforcing the prohibition is $100 billion a year. Now, what could that do to feed the starving, to, solve some of these ongoing dilemmas of the human species?
It would benefit the health system greatly.
Look, the money that gets spent on health systems and education, all sorts of services. And I guess the point is that there are limited resources in the world, and the prohibition just is not practical.
No. Now, on a day-to-day basis, what does your job involve?
Look, the drug policy Australia is certainly just trying to get the message out to the general public, but really focus its message on the unconvinced. So, we offer a speaker services where we do a little bit of media, we pursue public media. Personally, I write a few articles for newspapers, but just get out as an advocacy organisation and, put a reasonable case that, look, we're not trying to advocate for drug use, it's beyond that.
So a lot of it is harm reduction as well?
look, harm reduction. There are approaches that society can take to minimise the adverse effects of drug use. And look, we're not burying ourselves in the sand. Of course there's adverse effects to drug use. People can get addicted to cannabis to the point it demotivates themselves and that doesn't perhaps agree with their own goals and ambitions. Harder drugs certainly have problems. Alcohol is a drug of massive problems. And drug
I've heard you mention before it's the person too as well that plays a big role in the addiction and the level of where they're at. Some people, they might not be affected as what somebody else would be. It varies, doesn't it?
Look, exactly right. And the libertarian philosophy had made the case in the 17th century that what one puts into one's own mind and body, the individual should be sovereign.
That's right.
That's a very simple piece of philosophy.
Especially when it's not impacting on anybody else's lives.
Well, that's the irony of these drug laws, if you like. Now, cannabis is a classic example of that principle, where somebody consuming a substance in the privacy of their home should not be charged with a criminal offence. Now, these are philosophical as much as practical reasons. I mean, for God's sake, you can't physically enforce a prohibition what happens inside someone's bedroom or someone's lounge room. Now, these were wise men from the 17th, 18th century that decreed and looked at these issues of what should the criminal law protect. And it was decided almost by unanimous decision in terms of the democratic institutions that it should protect people from crimes against them by others against themselves. Murder, rape, pillage. And look, if you look at the law, criminal law, the absurd levels we've sunk to today, the drug crimes often attract a higher penalty than rape and murder.
And violent and sexual crimes.
Absolutely, Jeff.
When it comes down to consuming a substance, there's a level of privacy and efficacy involved. If they're in their own home and it's not affecting anybody else, you know, so be it. You know, that should be their right. You know, under a sovereign country, it's part of your civil rights, and that should not be violated.
Absolutely. It's a libertarian argument there in terms of philosophical arguments of what the law should do, but as I said before, it's also a practical consideration, and the law physically can't enforce these laws. And
no, it's not practical.
It's not practical, but the only way you can do it is turn your democratic country into a totalitarian country.
Right. Tyrannical.
And that is the great tragedy of what's happened in Australia.
Now, with your political endeavours, have you faced much resistance along the way?
Look, there's been resistance from, I guess, a conservative faction just wanting to maintain the status quo. We're, I think, raising the need for reform. There are now substantial subsectors of Australia that get that the prohibition, enforcing the prohibition, just simply does not work. And it's going to be a long fight to change these laws. It will happen. It will happen.
Take a combined effort.
Look, it'll take good people of my generation to stand up, stand out, and make the case. And it's very easy, I guess, to sit back and say, look, that's the law now, there's nothing we can do about it. But if that was the case, we'd still have slavery, we'd still have apartheid, we'd still have the persecution of homosexuals. This is a social conscience issue, pivotal issue. It's one of the major human rights issues of our time. The fact that 10%, about 2 million Australians, are persecuted and potentially prosecuted for performing an action that hurts no one except themselves. Around the world, the cost is just inordinate, and at the end of the day, it affects people's health,
their livelihoods.
Yep.
Yeah, well, you've spoken at some large events, you've given some very powerful speeches. What are some of the places you've spoke at?
Thank you. Look, I get up to the Nimbin Mardi Gras Festival every year, and that's a terrific chance to put the case and talk to some people. The drug law reform movement, the cannabis reform movement, is just beginning to get some momentum in Australia, and cannabis is a very good, the Mardi Gras is a very good venue for that. We've had a couple of meetings in Melbourne at the Ethogenesis organisation. They have a conference every 2 years. And
there's a large audience that attends?
Yeah, and again, people, activists, with various perhaps special interests. The interest in psychedelic drugs is a particularly interesting movement, a little bit separate to the cannabis movement, which might be seen as a little bit more mainstream.
Yeah.
But the move to legalise and regulate psychoactive substances is also gaining momentum and acceptance.
I've heard it helps with such things as cluster headaches and problems of that nature. Psychedelics, it alleviates some of the pressure on the brain, and it works better than what they've seen with any pharmaceuticals.
Absolutely, and look, here's the tragedy of the drug prohibition. We go back to the 40s, before these substances were banned and considered no-go zones of either medical research because of their potential for so-called abuse. There were many compounds that were being examined by science for therapeutic benefits. And with the prohibition and the encroaching nature of prohibition, where more substances and more chemicals are added to this list of prohibited substances, medical research stopped dead. Now, the psychedelics you talk of, yes, there's many indications it can help many conditions of migraines, but perhaps more than that is the post-traumatic stress syndrome of some of the veterans, where there's been incredible indications, again with limited scientific and medical trials, because it's been impossible to confirm it.
That's right.
But the future of, let's say, some of your compounds from mushrooms, psilocybin, LSD itself has been used therapeutic. But more than that, MDMA is a fantastic substance for allowing people perhaps to examine their inner anxieties and fears.
And it can help with depression too, can't it?
Look, some of these compounds can help with depression.
And serotonin that's released.
You mentioned a brain chemical there. Here's the beautiful thing about the age we live in, where we are now with neuroscience beginning to delve into how the human brain works, to get into the release of the chemical. Oh, look, it's just brilliant, exciting. Discoveries in how the brain works, how we love, how we emote, how drugs work, and how some of these psychological damage that's been done, often through traumatic events of perhaps rape or violence in early childhood, broken homes, can be repaired perhaps with some of these drugs that become an aid to psychotherapy.
And in a cutting age of technology, you think that information would be at people's use. They would be able to know that, they could be able to speak to their pharmacist, they would have that prescribed for them. I mean, if you can prescribe opium and other illicit substances and legalise it in that form, that should be open to people as well, if that's going to have a beneficial impact on their life and they're going to get a medicinal benefit from it.
Absolutely. It just defies common sense why you would close off some of these substances because of some fear that they could be misused.
And they can't be taxed, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, here you raise an interesting point about tax. If we did legalise, let's say, the cannabis market, there'd be $500 billion perhaps in potential tax revenue. And look, as strange as this sounds, this is what is happening across the world today. We've got Canada has slated, announced at the United Nations that it will fully legalise cannabis. Now, that's a Commonwealth country.
That was a big victory.
Just like Australia, yes. And they're now looking and preparing for that event. The United States currently, as we speak here 1 week before the election, currently has 4 states with legalised cannabis, but there are 6 ballot initiatives that they have over in America to legalise cannabis. And this is not the medical cannabis, where you had 26 states approximately that has legalised medical cannabis for the last 20 years. But this is the full legalisation of recreational cannabis.
So can you tell me about the arrest rates for simple recreational use?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question that often slips through to the keeper. People think that the cannabis laws have been watered down in Australia, but that's just not the case. It'll shock you to know that there's 77,000 Australians, let me say that again, 77,000 Australians arrested for cannabis last year.
That is alarming.
Look, it's just shocking. Now, that's an official report from the Australian the Criminal Intelligence Unit. They conduct figures on arrests Australia-wide. Now, more shocking than 77,000 Australians arrested for cannabis, 87% of those are for consumer offences only. So let's put that another way. Only 13% of those cannabis arrests are for the so-called dealing charge.
Right.
And even those 13%, let's be honest, the threshold for dealing cannabis is so low that 10 plants can get you, or in fact, even 2 plants can get you a trafficking charge.
That's startling news.
Yeah, and Victoria, which is where we're speaking from, we had a 20% increase in the number of cannabis arrests in Australia, from 10,000 to 12,000 last year. Now look, admittedly some of these have diversion programs, but only about half of them end up with the diversion programs, and that's problematic in itself.
Yeah.
You know, forcing somebody into some educational system, or be re-educated, and to be put in a system simply for consuming a drug without any effect on other people.
Even forced rehabilitation is often on the cards, isn't it?
Look, I don't think it's such a big stretch, but let's compare this to Nazi Germany. The prohibition, the persecution of young people in this country has dramatic effects. We've got dogs, for God's sake, and again, think of Nazi Germany, but we've got dogs sniffing kids' groins, walking into a festival or a music event to have a good time with all their mates, having their groin sniffed by dogs for a little bit of pot. This has just got outrageous, and people don't seem to see this because we're in this cocoon. As the people in Nazi Germany were cocooned.
It is a dictatorship.
The social acceptable behaviours. Police having the right to run into people's homes without even knocking and searching for cannabis plants. Again harks back to a totalitarian state that's more akin to a Nazi totalitarian country than democratic Australia in the year 2016.
It's an outrage.
Look, I'm glad you say that, Jeff. 77,000 people. I just picture a line of young Australians.
It's staggering.
Yeah, and you know, predominantly young Australians of those 77,000 people that are arrested. But if they stood, as we did at primary school in PT classes, with our hand on the shoulder of the person next to us, that'd be a line of people 35 kilometres long, from here to Geelong, of people lining up, waiting to be put into the criminal justice system. And once they're in that system, it often has lifelong implications. It affects their ability to travel by getting
employment, all of it.
Visas, employment in certain industries, and the bulk of those 77,000 people do get criminal convictions recorded, so it can affect their employment opportunities. But even more than that, it drags these young people into a criminal justice system. It puts them at odds with the police that really should be developing in these young areas a respectful attitude to law enforcement and the police. Look, I remember as myself as a young kid at university smoking a lot of pot and loving it, as most people do. But having a very hesitant attitude to the police, because whenever I saw a police officer, I'd have that extra heartbeat and a thing that, they could search me and arrest me.
That's what they say, the most dangerous part about it is being caught with it, not the plan itself, isn't it?
Look, absolutely. The implications. Now, my point and my message to parents here is, why would you endorse a system that puts your children in harm's way of the potential risk? And look, it's just a misnomer to think it won't happen to your kids. 10% of Australians, that's 2 million Australians, 2 million Australians, predominantly young people.
You can't be naive about it.
You can't bury your hand in the sand, Jeff. It is madness.
And what new drug policies are you looking at introducing in the next 12 months?
Look, in the next 12 months we'd be optimistic. We're really seeing this as a long-term societal change, first in attitudes and then in the laws. In terms of the cannabis, it's very important we get down to I guess, what we as a reform movement want. Well, we want all of the criminal sanctions removed for cannabis use. And this would include growing and possessing cannabis. So we're arguing for the full legalisation of cannabis, full rights to use it for medicinal or other purposes.
Wonderful.
And there's even a fuzzy line between medicinal and personal use of cannabis. If someone is a bit depressed and they want to smoke a joint at the end of the day or of a weekend, surely that's a semi-medical use.
Some people would argue it's all medicinal, really.
Look, I think there's a respectable argument, although I think, to be fair, there is also a recreational use that may have medicinal purposes.
Yes, it's been a very enlightening and educational talk. I wish you continued success for your organisation, and all the best, Greg.
Lovely, thanks Jeff, thanks for coming out and having a chat.
Excellent.